Theoretically, any game can have a sequel added onto it. Since traditionally, all a sequel does is add on to the story of a previous installment, it's possible that any developer chooses to add on to the story of a game with another sequel. Currently, sequels seem a little awkward in the video game industry. There are tons of great sequels, but additionally, there are tons of sequels that are simply made for the sake of making a sequel. For a company to meet demands financially, they may continue a series that should not be continued, or rush a sequel that should have had a lot more thought put into it. Many developers show disdain for making sequels, such as Masahiro Sakurai, but press on to do so anyway with pressure from the company that supports them. Video games originally had little to no focus on story. Pong was simply a game where you hit a dot back and forth. You don't play Pac-Man and think, gee, I wonder what Pac-Man's life goals are. Even later, games like the Super Mario Bros. Or The Legend of Zelda hardly had a story. Mario searches castle after castle to defeat Bowser and save Princess Peach. Link goes dungeon by dungeon to collect the Triforce and defeat Ganon, rescuing Princess Zelda. If you wanted to go and get more story for The Legend of Zelda, you'd have to look into an official game guide. The stories back then were inaccessible, vague, short, or just non-existent. It's funny too because when you think of The Legend of Zelda, one of its most ambitious features are epic storylines and vast lore. The growth in story in video games from their conception to today is largely due to the advancement of technology, which has progressed phenomenally. In 1991, when Sonic the Hedgehog was released for the Sega Genesis, the 2-second Sega chime and logo took up 1/8 of the game's total storage, which goes to show how much developers could add in their games back then. Not much at all. Today, however, with 50GB games not being uncommon, there's a huge variety of games in terms of how they set up their proportions. And what I mean by proportions is how much focus is on gameplay versus story versus graphics versus combat, etc. Some games I even go to the lengths of just calling movie games for the fact that the gameplay feels extremely minimal and the game is so focused on cinematics and or story that it just feels like playing through a film. So when making sequels, now developers can have the creative liberty to do it in a matter of ways. When before a sequel simply meant just adding on to the previous game with different levels or new mechanics and slapping on the number 2 after the title, now games can have an in-depth story just like a novel or a film, with enough information to warrant a sequel. There's a fine line though when it comes to stories in video game sequels. When the game requires too much information from the previous installment, then much of the story of the sequel goes over the player's head. Kingdom Hearts 2 is a great game and works well as a standalone title, but from a story perspective, it keeps the player in a confused state throughout the game, especially in the beginning. Throughout the first Kingdom Hearts game, the player plays as Sora, who defeats Heartless and eventually fights Ansem, Seeker of Darkness. Kingdom Hearts 2 was not the direct sequel to Kingdom Hearts, however. It was 2 years later in 2004 that Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories came out for the Game Boy Advance, following the story of Sora where he finds Castle Oblivion. It's here where Sora learns of Twilight Town, the other side of his heart, and Diz, a pseudonym for Ansem the Wise. Overall, in terms of story, Chain of Memories brings a lot to the table and expands greatly upon the previous lore of Kingdom Hearts, tying up many loose ends while also raising more questions. Come 1 year later in 2005, Kingdom Hearts 2 is released for the PlayStation 2. By this time, Kingdom Hearts has sold over 5 million copies, whereas Chain of Memories, being a handheld title, sold only over 1 million worldwide. 1 million is a lot, but when compared to the 5 million that purchased Kingdom Hearts, that's only roughly 20% of the fanbase that knows how the story progressed after Kingdom Hearts. With Kingdom Hearts 2, there are dozens of references to Chain of Memories that make no sense to anyone who only played Kingdom Hearts. In fact, the first few hours of the game are played as this guy. Is that Sora with a new haircut? Older Sora? Sora's new cousin? No, this is Roxas, the other side of Sora's heart, mentioned by Vexen from Chain of Memories. The concept of Twilight Town and Ansem creating fake memories for Roxas are developed, along with the introduction of Namine, a major character in Kingdom Hearts. So unless you are one of the 20%, the whole beginning section of this game makes no sense at all. Once the player actually starts playing as Sora, then things begin to make more sense as the game explains itself more and actually relates to the events of the original Kingdom Hearts. Before that, you were just confused, and many people stopped playing before they made it past Roxas' story. Kingdom Hearts has some major flaws as a series, but overall, I would still say it's a great one. While some games try to focus too much on story and lose gameplay because of it, Kingdom Hearts manages to do both. And that's part of the reason why Kingdom Hearts 2 picks itself up after a shaky, confusing beginning. But for a game that does have a huge focus on story like Kingdom Hearts, the fact that there even is a confusing beginning is a poor mistake that causes the slow start that it has. Of course, one may argue, why should a sequel cater to someone who didn't bother to play the game before it? You don't start the Harry Potter series by reading The Prisoner of Azkaban. You read The Sorcerer's Stone and Chamber of Secrets first. It's your fault if you start there and try to make sense of the series when you're missing crucial plot points, several characters, and many critical events that happened previously. Video games are not books, nor are they movies. Books in a series will have consistent numbers in terms of sales because they are all published on the same medium. The market is a lot more set in stone. Same goes for movies. You buy tickets to go see a movie. That much hasn't changed in decades. Video games are a lot more spontaneous in terms of how much popularity they receive. And so it makes sense that Kingdom Hearts sales outperformed the Chain of Memory sales by the margin that it did. So with the release of Kingdom Hearts 2 back on the PlayStation, and being 3 years after the series' beginnings, Square Enix had a much bigger audience to cater to. Instead, they integrated the story of Kingdom Hearts 2 in such a way that it missed the point with most consumers, as they hadn't played Chain of Memories. Games are a lot more expensive and a lot harder to access when the series can span over a vast time. Since they have much shorter shelf lives and can be difficult to access thanks to the change of consoles over the years, nobody wants to feel like they're missing something when they play a game, like there's some requirement they don't meet that can't be fulfilled just by playing the game itself. Video games should be fun above all and capture the mind of the viewer, putting them in a different world where they can lose themselves. That's why video game sequels should still be able to stand on their own, especially when it's for such a major release like Kingdom Hearts 2. It wasn't the niche market that was Chain of Memories. You may think you would lose the elements of story with this stand-alone approach in attempt for sequels. But the great thing about video games is how much versatility they have. There are ways to reference the previous game in the series without it being essential to understand the plot. There are ways of teaching the player what they missed in the last game without being boring and still engaging them in the story. Don't make a video game sequel on Chapter 100 expecting the player to have read the last 99 of them. The beauty of video games as a medium for telling a story is how many different ways there are in approaching sequels. Depending on how the events of the previous game turned out, sometimes it's not necessary for there to be another sequel. By this I mean doing something like giving the same protagonist simply a new antagonist each sequel isn't the way to go. Sometimes it may be better to do a look into the past. I'm of course talking about prequels. Sometimes to add on to the story of a game, an origin story or a precursor to the last installment is important. Crisis Core was the prequel to Final Fantasy VII, released on the PlayStation Portable. It makes use of many interesting parts of Final Fantasy VII and details on it, showing how Claude got his sword and why Sephiroth descended into madness. After the first two installments of the Zelda series, with the new Super Nintendo Entertainment System, much more could be provided in terms of story and delivering it, and so A Link to the Past was born. As the name implies, the game shows how the past history of Hyrule before the NES titles and further elaborates on them. What's great about this title is that while it is a prequel, it doesn't require the player to know the story of the first two Zelda games to be burdened by it. You just jump right into the fray in A Link to the Past, and anyone can start with this game and have a great time with it. That leads to another way sequels can be made, and that's as spiritual successors. Instead of taking a direct approach to a sequel with the same cast and a continued story, sometimes a sequel can be done well by holding the same universe with a new spin. Paper Mario can be considered a spiritual successor to the Super Mario RPG, holding true to the turn-based mechanic and adding a vast world to explore with a new gimmick. While many titles in the Zelda franchise are direct sequels like Ocarina of Time to Majora's Mask, or The Legend of Zelda to Zelda 2, the bulk of the games in the series are simply spiritual successors. They mostly all take place in Hyrule, but the links that happen to inhabit the games are usually separated by hundreds of years, linked only by the bloodline or the fact that they are the chosen heroes. Spiritual successors, from a story perspective, are a simple way to fix the balance of video games. Since all the characters are in a new era, there would be no immediate story that has to be known by the player. But at the same time, many elements of the previous story can be woven into the sequel's universe. It would be interesting to see how more games could focus on continuing their story in unique ways of delivering sequels like this. If there is a series with 2 or more games released for it, an interquel can be made to bridge those games together, detailing the events in between them. Or a game would be a spiritual successor to one, an interquel could be the glue to bind them into a trilogy. Kingdom Hearts does this with 358 over 2 days. Being released in 2009, it lets the player experience Roxas' time in Organization 13, somewhere between the events of Kingdom Hearts and Kingdom Hearts 2. By using different approaches to the story like this, the player can stay immersed in the series. Another way to have an interrupting sequel is with what's been dubbed a midquel, where a sequel takes the events that happened in the previous work and expand on them before the completion of the story in that previous work. Changing the player's perspective, a sidequel is a sequel where the events take place during the events of a previous installment, but instead are focused on a different set of characters or a different take on the story. Similarly, a paraquel focuses on a story not about the outcome, but instead on the characters and reveals information that was previously unknown to the player. Finally, companion pieces are meant to complement each other, creating a full story by completing both of them. You can consider the Pokemon series full of companion pieces, with each installment adding a new pair of companion pieces, red and blue, gold and silver, ruby and sapphire, etc. But I think a better example of this done well in games is with Zelda Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons. Don't get me wrong, Pokemon is still a great series, but I just think that Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages does the companion piece better than Pokemon. These are 2 separate games where Link faces 2 different quests in 2 different storylines with different characters. One focuses more on combat, while the other focuses more on puzzles. After completing one, more information and story is given that links to the other games. It's a beautiful combination that shows how well companion pieces can be done in games, although they are rare outside of Pokemon. My point in saying all of this is that developers can really expand the story of games in unique ways without having to force sequel after sequel in a monotonous way with having the heroes just defeat a new insert villain here. There are a vast amount of ways to approach each story, and although they may seem abstract or hard to accomplish, video games are such a diverse medium that almost anything is possible. The Oracle games are proof that an obscure method of storytelling like companion pieces can work well and tell a great story. All the while, the player can still enjoy the sequel without having to fully understand the previous story. That's when it works. The player can still be given a rich world to learn about without having to have played the previous title. Yes, there is a fine line, and Kingdom Hearts 2 crossed it. It's a great game with many fun and epic parts to the story, but its presentation as a sequel was too complicated and confusing to the player that its beginning gave players migraines. Contrary to everything I just said though, I actually did really enjoy the beginning of Kingdom Hearts 2, but that's because I'm a nerd. I'm a nerd who will go out of my way to look up the lore in a series and is generally interested in its history more than an actual history class. But the thing is, just because I care doesn't mean most people do. The game is so boring in the beginning, it's so slow and monotonous and not fun that unless you're really interested in it, the game has no way of saying, hey, you should be interested in me. Game shouldn't have to force you to learn about itself. It should make you want to learn about it. That's when a game's done right. Anyway, a game shouldn't require a compendium information, an unrealistic amount of knowledge, or an overbearing understanding of the series mythos to understand it. Let me just sit down, be immersed in this world, and play the game. Sequel or not, let the story come through the game itself, because when the game doesn't require you to look up a wiki article, ask a friend on Skype, or just read through the forums to understand what's going on in the story, then that's when that truly beautiful phenomenon, where you feel like you're learning something, but you're not actually being forced to learn it. It's teaching without teaching. This ties back to my other video where I talk about how games shouldn't yell the story at you. They should immerse it in such a way that you learn it through playing the game. And so when a sequel does this properly, then you won't have to have played the games before it. You won't have to have looked it up on the wiki or asked your friends to tell you the story or looked it up on the forums. You can play the sequel on its own, and it will make you want to play the game that came out before it. That's when a sequel's done right. So that's been my opinion for the past 15 minutes or so. This is just my personal philosophy with how sequels and approaching a new title to a series should be done in video games for the most part. Of course, since I said it's my opinion, it doesn't mean it's factual or totally correct. I mean, I use facts to support it, but in the end, it's just how I believe sequels should be done in video games. But hey, if you think sequels should be done a totally different way in video games, why don't you leave a comment below and explain how you think sequels should be done in video games? Maybe they should be done like in books, where you need to know all the information in the last book to understand and really get the point of the story in the new game. But anyway, please like, comment, and subscribe because I put a lot of work into this video, and it's almost 16 minutes long now, so thanks for watching.